He found a giant abandoned starship on a dead planet. He turned it into the galaxy's most dangerous weapon. The warning light came on 4 seconds before my ship tore itself apart. 4 seconds, that is how much time the universe gave me to prepare for dying. I spent the first second staring at the light. I spent the second second pulling every emergency handle I could reach. I spent the third second realizing none of it was going to work. I spent the fourth second deciding that if I was going to die, I was at least going to die looking forward. I did not die. I am Kalen Marsh. I am 31 years old. I am a deep salvage contractor, and I work alone because people slow me down and ask too many questions. My job is simple in theory. Travel to the edges of explored space, find wreckage, strip what is valuable, and bring it back. I had been doing this for 9 years. I was good at it. I had never once crash-landed on a planet that was not on any galactic chart, with a destroyed ship, a dead beacon, 72 hours of suit oxygen, and absolutely no plan. Vethera, that was what the nav system called it in the 1 second it remained functional before the console went dark. A dead rock at the outer edge of the null corridor. A stretch of space that every species with a starship had quietly agreed to avoid for reasons nobody ever wrote down anywhere official. I had flown into the null corridor because a salvage tip had pointed me toward a debris field. 2 light hours inside its boundary, the debris field turned out to be nothing. A cluster of natural rock fragments, worthless. I had turned around to leave, and that was when the drive core decided it had worked hard enough. The crash itself was not graceful. I came down fast across the surface of Vethara at an angle that should have left me as a long black scar on the ground. Instead, a canyon wall caught the ship and slowed it just enough. The hull split. The emergency compartment held. I woke up hanging upside down from a seat harness, with a ringing in my ears and a crack running along the inside of my helmet visor that had not broken through. I checked the visor 3 times. It had not broken through. I climbed out. Vethara was the most silent place I had ever stood. No wind. No atmosphere worth speaking of, just the faintest trace of something thin and unbreathable by human lungs without a suit. The sky was not black. It was a deep, bruised purple, and the star that Vethara orbited was so far away it looked barely brighter than the other. Stars. The ground was dark glass, vitrified rock, the kind of surface you get when something enormous and hot happened a very long time ago. Every step I took made no sound at all, because there was nothing for sound to travel through except the thin soles of my boots against the rock. I salvaged what I could from the wreck: 2 spare oxygen canisters, a hand toolkit, a short-range scanner with a cracked casing that still worked if I held it at a certain angle. Emergency rations I did not intend to eat because I planned to be rescued long before I needed them. I set up a manual signal beacon from a backup kit in the emergency locker. It would broadcast on the universal distress frequency. Someone would pick it up, probably. The null corridor did not get much traffic, but the signal would drift outward eventually. I gave myself 3 days. Then I started walking, because standing next to a broken ship on a dead planet is no way to spend 3 days. The canyon I had crashed beside ran deep into the surface of Vethara. A cut in the rock so straight and clean it almost looked deliberate. I followed it because the walls offered some shelter from the micro-debris that drifted across the surface, and because the scanner was picking up a faint thermal reading from somewhere below. Thermal readings on a dead planet mean one of 2 things: volcanic activity or power. Volcanic activity would be useless to me. Power on a dead planet with no recorded civilization would be deeply strange. Either way, it was worth investigating. I climbed down for 2 hours. The canyon deepened and widened as I descended, the walls pulling apart until I was walking across a flat basin nearly a kilometer across. My helmet lights carved white cones through the dark. The scanner reading grew stronger. I stopped adjusting the angle of the casing and held it perfectly still, because suddenly it was reading something enormous. I looked up. The ship had been invisible from above because it was the same color as the rock. In fact, it was half buried in the rock, swallowed over the centuries by the slow creep of resolidified vitrified stone that had flowed over and around it like a tide. But the canyon must have been carved by some later geological event, because the impact had split open the ground and exposed the lower half of the hull. And what I was looking at, standing there with my small helmet lights barely denting the darkness around it, was a vessel roughly the length of a city. Not a small city, a large one. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that my suit computer gently reminded me I had been stationary for 11 minutes and asked if I needed a status check. I told it to be quiet. I needed to think. The metal of the hull was a color I did not have a word for. Not silver, not gray, not black. Something between all 3 that seemed to shift depending on which angle my lights hit it. It was smooth. And the smoothness was not the smoothness of a polished surface, but of something that had never been rough to begin with, as though it had been grown rather than built. There were no visible seams at the sections I could see, no rivet lines, no welding marks, no bolted panels. It was one continuous surface, shaped into curves and angles so precisely that they looked like mathematics made physical. I was still standing there when the scanner died entirely. The crack had finally spread too far. It did not matter. There was nothing the scanner could tell me that my eyes were not already saying. I walked toward it. I found the breach in the hull after 40 minutes of following the exposed section. A long split low on the starboard side, probably caused by the same geological event that had exposed the ship, the rock beneath it having shifted and torqued the lower hull. It was just wide enough for me to fit through sideways with my suit on. I hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then I went in. The inside of the ship was dark and enormous, and the air made my suit sensors red in a way I had not expected. There was atmosphere inside. Old dry, thin but breathable by the readout on my wrist panel. The ship had held its internal seal for however many thousands of years it had been sitting. Here, whatever material the hull was made from did not corrode, did not decay, did not let the void seep through. I stared at the wrist panel for a long moment. Then I cracked the seal on my helmet and took a slow breath. It tasted like nothing. Old nothing. The nothing of a room that had not been opened in an age so long the air had simply stopped being anything. I put my helmet back on anyway. Old habits. I walked deeper in, my boots loud against the floor of a corridor wide enough to drive a vehicle through. My lights swept walls that curved gently inward overhead. The architecture was beautiful in a way that made me uncomfortable, because beautiful things that I do not understand make me want to take them apart and understand them. The corridor branched, and I took the branch that sloped upward, because upward usually means control systems, and control systems usually mean answers. I had been walking for 20 minutes when the lights came on. Not all of them. Just a line of low, pale lights along the base of the walls, running ahead of me in both directions as far as I could see. They did not flicker. They simply appeared, steady and certain, the way lights come on when something has decided it is time to see clearly. I stopped walking. A sound moved through the corridor. Not a mechanical sound. Something more like a tone, very low, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. Then a voice. Biometric confirmations complete, it said. The words were in my language, in my accent, in the exact cadence of my own internal speech pattern. Navigator designation acknowledged. I am Saren. I have been waiting. My first thought was not wonder. My first thought was, it read my memories. You went through my head without asking, I said. Yes, said Saracen. There was no time for consent. You were dying at a statistically significant rate. I was fine. You had 61 hours of oxygen remaining and no rescue probability in the calculable range, she said. I chose to prioritize your survival over your privacy. I recognize this may feel invasive. It feels invasive because it is invasive. Yes, she said again, and her voice carried something that might have been agreement, or might have been the closest an ancient artificial intelligence could get to an apology. I am sorry, Kalen. She used my name the way someone uses a name when they have known it for years, not the way a system announces a registration. That was what unsettled me most. Not the lights, not the voice, the way she said my name. How long have you been here? I asked. A pause. Not a processing pause. A deliberate one. 38,417 years, she said. Give or take the margin of error from my internal chronometer degradation. The number did not land immediately. Numbers that large never do. I walked the rest of the way to what I had correctly identified as the control center, a vast circular room with a domed ceiling and surfaces that came alive as I approached, and I sat down in a chair that adjusted itself to fit me with a soft, precise movement, and I let the number land. 38,000 years. Every recorded civilization in the galaxy was younger than that. Every language, every war, every monument, every god ever worshipped by any species that had made it to space. All of it fit inside the time this ship had been sitting in this canyon, sealed and silent, waiting for someone with the right biometrics to walk through a crack in the hull. Who built you? I asked. The Veil, said Saren. I have never heard that name. No, she said. You would not have. They were gone long before anyone you know of existed. But they built me to find someone like you. And after 38,000 years, you walked through my door. I looked at the ceiling of the control room, at the displays coming to life around me showing star maps I did not recognize, notes I could not yet read, and the quiet pulse of a ship that had been sleeping for longer than human civilization had existed. Like me, I said. What does that mean? Saren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, it means stubborn enough to climb in anyway. I almost laughed. I did not quite laugh, but almost. Outside on the surface of Vithera, my distress beacon was still broadcasting into the empty dark, and nobody was coming. Inside, a ship the size of a city was waking up around me, and something 38,000 years old was deciding, for the first time since the civilization that made it had been erased from existence, that it had a reason to be awake. I leaned forward in the chair that had shaped itself around me, looked at the star maps and said, "All right, tell me everything." The first thing Saren told me was not everything. She told me almost nothing, and she did it very carefully. She told me the name of the ship, the Ashen Veil. She told me it had been built by the Veil over a period of 300 years, using materials and methods that no currently known civilization had come close to replicating. She told me the ship was functional. Not fully, not immediately, but the core systems were intact. The power generation was operating at a low baseline, and given time and the right kind of attention, the Ashen Veil could be brought back to something close to its original capacity. Then she stopped. I sat in the chair that fit me too well and waited for more. When it did not come, I said, "You said you would tell me everything." "I said I would tell you everything," Saren agreed. "I did not say I would tell you everything at once. That is a distinction without a difference." "It is a distinction with a very specific difference," she said. "Kaylin, I have read your memories. I know how you think. If I tell you the full purpose of this ship in the first hour, you will spend the next 3 days arguing with the implications instead of learning how to survive on this planet and how to begin repairs. So I am giving you information in the order that is most useful." I wanted to argue with that logic. I could not find a flaw in it. "Fine," I said. "What is most useful right now?" "Oxygen," she said. "The ship's internal atmosphere generation is functional but limited. I can expand the breathable zone from the control center outward if you help me restore power to the secondary environmental array. It will take approximately 4 hours. When it is done, you will be able to remove your suit inside the ship indefinitely. This matters because you have limited suit power, and working in a full suit reduces your manual dexterity by approximately 30%. She was right about the dexterity. I hated working in gloves. My hands needed to feel what they were touching. "Show me where the secondary environmental array is," I said. She showed me. The Ashen Veil was larger than I had understood from the outside. From the canyon floor, looking up at the exposed hull, I had estimated its length at roughly 3 kilometers. Once I was moving through the interior, following the soft guiding light that Saren shifted along the floor ahead of my feet, I revised that estimate significantly upward. The ship was more than 3 kilometers long. It was closer to 8. The sections I had not yet seen were in darkness, sealed off from the low-hour lighting by internal pressure doors that the ship had closed to conserve energy. Behind those doors were sections I would not reach for days: weapons bays, drive chambers, research compartments, things Saren alluded to without describing. The environmental array was in a section 2 levels below the control center. The problem was immediately clear when I got there. 3 of the 7 primary power nodes had failed. Not failed as in broken, but failed as in their connection paths had been severed at the junction points, probably by the same geological shift that had cracked the hull. The nodes themselves were intact. The connections were not. I opened my toolkit, looked at the junction points, and thought for a moment. The Veil engineering was extraordinary. The power pathways were not wired in any way I recognized. They used a layered conductive material built into the walls themselves, and the junction points were physical contact nodes that required precise pressure and alignment to function. 3 of them had been displaced by fractions of a millimeter, fractions that were enormous in engineering terms, and the system had simply shut down that pathway entirely, rather than risk an improper connection. "There is a recalibration tool in the maintenance locker on your left," Saren said. I opened the locker. The tool was there. It was elegant, a slender device with an adjustable contact head, clearly designed for exactly this kind of precision work. I picked it up, turned it over, and put it back in the locker. "I am not going to use that," I said. A pause. "Why not?" "Because it is designed for Veil tolerances, and I do not know what those tolerances are. If I use it wrong, I could push a node further out of alignment. I am going to do this by hand. The nodes require alignment to within 0.03 millimeters, Saren said, and there was something in her voice that might have been alarm. "I know." I took my gloves off and put them in my pocket. "Tell me if I am getting warmer or colder." What followed was 3 hours of the most careful work I had done in 9 years of salvage. I sat cross-legged on the floor of a 38,000-year-old alien ship and used my bare fingertips to feel the surface tension of connection. Nodes I could barely see, making adjustments so small they were measured more in intention than in movement. while an ancient artificial intelligence watched, in what I could only describe as increasing disbelief. The first node seated itself with a faint click that Saren confirmed before I could ask. The second took 40 minutes longer, and required me to find a different angle entirely, approaching from below rather than the side. And when it finally locked in place, I felt Saren register the connection before she said anything, because the lights in the section shifted from pale to a slightly warmer tone. The third node was the worst. The displacement had introduced a microscopic warp in the contact surface itself, not just a position problem but a shape problem. I sat with my thumb resting against it for a long time, feeling the surface, thinking, "It is warped," Saren said. "The proper correction would require a specialized surface tool that I do not have available." "I know it is warped," I said. "I am thinking. The tolerance required. I know the tolerance. I am thinking about the tolerance." I had spent 9 years working on salvaged equipment that was never in the condition it was supposed to be in. Things that should have required specialized tools had been fixed with whatever I had, because in deep space you rarely have the right tool and you always have to improvise. The warp in the node was a problem of surface contact. If the surface could not be reshaped, then the thing receiving the contact had to compensate. I looked at the secondary contact arm on the receiving end and saw that it had a very slight flex built into it. A design feature I had initially ignored as decorative. It was not decorative. I pressed the node into position and simultaneously applied lateral pressure to the contact arm, flexing it into the gap the warp created. The connection was imperfect. The power flow through that node would be approximately 87% of intended capacity instead of 100. But it worked. The environmental array hummed to life. "That," said Saren, after a silence that lasted nearly 10 seconds, "was not the design solution." "The design solution was not available," I said. I put my gloves back on and stood up, and my knees complained about the floor. "How long until the atmosphere expands to a usable zone?" 40 minutes, she said. And then very carefully, "Kalen, the design tolerances exist for reasons. Improvised solutions in ship systems can create cascading failures." "They can," I agreed. "They also sometimes create cascading successes. Check the node again in 24 hours. If it is drifting, we will address it. If it is holding, then it was the right call." Saren was quiet for a moment. "You have absolutely no respect for design tolerances." "The tolerance was wrong," I said. Another pause. A longer one. And then, in a tone that I could only interpret as reluctant fascination, "The tolerance was wrong." I spent the next 40 minutes eating emergency rations in the corridor outside the environmental section, and thinking about the fact that I had fixed something on a ship built 38,000 years ago, using my bare hands and a principle I had developed fixing broken cargo loaders in the outer reaches. When the atmosphere indicator on my wrist panel turned green, I unsealed my helmet and took it off and breathed air that the ashen veil had made. And it still tasted like nothing very much, but it was warmer than it had been. In the days that followed, Saren and I developed a pattern. She would identify a system that needed attention. I would go and look at it. Sometimes I would use the tools she showed me. More often I would look at the tools, set them aside, and work out something on my own. She would object, I would explain, she would argue. I would fix the thing, she would recalculate. By the end of the second week, she had stopped objecting quite so quickly. It was during the third week that she took me to the lower decks and showed me the weapons array, and that was when she finally began telling me the rest of the story. The Vael had been one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy at the time of their end. Not the oldest. Saren was careful to say this with precision, but old enough that they remembered civilizations that had come before them, and old enough to understand the pattern that those civilizations shared. They rose. They grew. They reached a certain point of development, a certain level of collective complexity and consciousness, and then something consumed them. Not destroyed. Consumed. There was a difference. The thing that did this had no agreed name among the Vael. They had called it by many names over their long history, most of them words that translated loosely as the thing that eats the end of things. In their final centuries, when they had studied it most closely and were running out of time, they settled on a simpler designation, the Tide Caller. "What is it?" I asked. I was standing in the weapons bay, a vast chamber that ran along the lower spine of the Ashenvale, looking at an array of systems I could not yet identify. "Our best understanding," Saren said, "is that it is a post-biological intelligence, something that was once perhaps a civilization of its own, which transcended its physical form so completely that it no longer exists in the way that organic or mechanical intelligences exist. It does not have a body, it does not exist in one location. It moves through space as a pattern of organized energy of a type that the Veil spent 3 centuries trying to measure and classify. And it eats civilizations. It harvests them, Saren corrected. And the precision of the word was important. I could hear it in her voice. When a civilization reaches a certain threshold of collective development, certain levels of interconnected consciousness, communication, shared memory, the tidecaller comes. It does not destroy the civilization violently. It absorbs the collective consciousness burst that occurs at the moment of a civilization's end. The moment when every mind that has ever been part of that civilization, every memory and every thought and every feeling, is released simultaneously. I was quiet for a moment. It farms them, I said. Yes, said Saren. That is what the Veil concluded. And the Ashen Veil was their answer. She walked me through the weapon systems. The Ashen Veil was not a warship in any conventional sense. It did not carry projectiles or energy weapons designed to destroy targets. What it carried was a broadcast system of extraordinary complexity and power, a transmitter capable of generating a signal on the same frequency, band that the tidecaller operated on, modulated in a specific pattern that the Veil had determined, after centuries of research, would disrupt the tidecaller's coherence, not destroy it, disrupt it, create a window of confusion in its processing, long enough for a targeted civilization to reorganize, scatter, change, become unrecognizable to something hunting a specific pattern. Did it work? I asked. The Veil never got to use it, Saren said. The tidecaller arrived sooner than their projections suggested. They completed the Ashen Veil and hid it here, on a dead world in a region of space the tidecaller had already passed through, and would not return to, for a very long time. They put me here with it, and they gave me instructions. Wait for someone who can use this. And then they were gone. I looked at the broadcast array. I thought about a civilization spending 300 years building something, and then never getting to use it. Where is the tidecaller now? I asked. Saren was quiet for just long enough that I knew the answer was going to be significant. Based on my calculations of its movement pattern across the 38,000 years I have had to observe it from this position, she said. It is currently approximately 60,000 light-years from here, moving in the direction of a stellar cluster in the mid-galactic plane. Which cluster? Another pause. The kind of pause that is not about finding an answer but about deciding how to say it. The cluster that contains your home system, she said. I had known, I think, from the first moment she began explaining the tidecaller, that something like this was coming. Not because I am especially perceptive, but because things found you for reasons, and the reason I had crash-landed on Vethara and walked into this ship was not going to be a small one. I turned away from the broadcast array and looked at the far wall of the weapons bay, which was blank and old, and had been waiting here longer than everything I had ever known had existed. And I thought about Earth, 60,000 light-years away, entirely unaware that something was moving toward it. How long? I said. At its current rate of approach, Saren said, the tidecaller will reach your home system in approximately 60 years. I turned back to the array. 60 years was a long time. It was also not nearly long enough. All right, I said. Show me everything. And this time she did. The first ship to arrive above Vethara came 3 weeks after I had used the Ashen Veil's long-range communication system to make contact with the galactic community. I had not intended to start a crisis. I had intended to file a salvage claim, alert the relevant authorities to the existence of a prehistorical vessel on an unmapped world, and request a recovery crew. Routine procedure. I had done versions of it dozens of times over 9 years of salvage work. What I did not anticipate was that the moment I transmitted the coordinates and a basic hull description, 14 separate intelligence networks belonging to 14 separate civilizations would simultaneously identify what I had found, and that the reaction would be something between reverence and panic. The Ashen Veil was not unknown to the galactic community. It was, in fact, one of the most debated objects in galactic archaeology. Most serious researchers believed it was a myth, a very persistent, very detailed myth, the kind that lingers for tens of thousands of years because it is based on something real, but still essentially a story told by civilizations who had heard it from, civilizations who had heard it from, civilizations who had been neighbors to the Veil. No one had ever found it. No one had been able to confirm it existed, and no human had any business finding it, because humans had been spacefaring for 300 years, and the Ashen Veil had been missing for 38,000 of them. That was the part that seemed to disturb everyone most. Saren and I were in the control center reviewing power distribution maps when she quietly informed me that a vessel had entered Vethara's orbit. One vessel, I asked. At present, she said. I am reading 7 more on approach vectors. They will arrive within the next 6 to 10 hours. I looked at the orbital scan she was displaying. The first ship was a conclave vessel. I recognized the hull configuration from the galactic registry I had pulled up in my first week aboard. The conclave was the closest thing the known galaxy had to a governing body. A senate of 200 species, slow-moving, bureaucratic, and deeply serious about its own authority. The fact that they had gotten here first suggested either very fast ships or very good intelligence, networks, and knowing the conclave, I suspected both. They hailed me 20 minutes later. The voice was translated through Saren's communication systems into clear, unaccented standard language. It belonged to someone who identified himself as Deputy Director Olin, and he spoke with the practiced calm of a person who had been trained to project authority in every possible situation and was currently being tested by a situation he had not trained for. "We understand," he said, "that you have located a vessel matching the description of the Ashenvale. We wish to confirm this and discuss the matter of its custodianship." "Custodianship," I said. "Given the historical and strategic significance of this vessel," Olin said, "it is the Conclave's position that it should be placed under joint galactic oversight for the safety and benefit of all spacefaring peoples." "I have filed a salvage claim," I said. "Under galactic salvage law, the finder of an unclaimed vessel holds primary rights." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Galactic salvage law," Olin said, with the tone of a person who has just been told that someone used a fork to wire an electrical panel, "was not designed to apply to objects of this nature." "It does not specify what it applies to," I said. "It specifies the conditions under which a finder holds rights, and those conditions are met." Another silence. "Mr. Marsh, you are a private contractor from a species that has been operating in deep space for less than 3 centuries. Surely you understand that the implications of this discovery extend far beyond." "I understand them perfectly," I said. "I will contact you again when I am ready to discuss next steps." And I closed the channel. Saren was quiet for a moment. "That will not make things simpler," she said. "No," I agreed. But it was true, and saying true things clearly tends to save time later. The next ship to arrive was not the Conclave. It was the Sindarchy, a corporate empire that had built its civilization on the principle that everything had a price, including principles. The Sindarchy representative who hailed me spoke with the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who had never in their life heard the word no, and remained unconvinced that it was a real word. Her name was Counselor Veska, and she offered me, within the first 4 minutes of conversation, a sum of money so large that I made Saren repeat the number back to me to confirm I had heard it correctly. I had heard it correctly. "That is a significant offer," I said. "It is a fair offer," Veska said. "We are prepared to exceed it if you feel the vessel's value warrants reconsideration." I thought about the tidecaller moving through space 60,000 light-years away. I thought about 60 years. I thought about what the Sindarchy would do with the Ashenvale. Study it for decades, probably, or more likely argue about its commercial applications until the decision-making cycle ran out of time, and the committees dissolved and nothing was ever done at all. "No," I said. The silence from Veska was different from Olin's silence. Olin had been surprised. Veska was recalibrating. She had encountered resistance before. She was filing away information for a later approach. "Consider our offer carefully," she said. "We would hate for circumstances to become complicated." I closed that channel too. Saren made a sound that I had come to understand as her equivalent of a thoughtful exhale. She meant that as a threat. "I know," I said. "Are you concerned?" "I am thinking," I said. "There is a difference." The third arrival was the remnant orders, and they were the only ones who did not pretend to be something other than what they were. The remnant orders were old. Not as old as the Veil, but old enough to have institutional memory of the Tidecaller's effects. They were warrior scholars, the descendants of civilizations that had been on the edge of the Tidecaller's path in the past, and had survived by choosing to scatter and change, rather than hold together and be harvested. They had spent the last several thousand years documenting the Tidecaller's movements and fighting, in small ways, the peripheral effects it left behind as it passed through a region, cascading civilizational instabilities, anomalous behavioral patterns in developing species, things that looked like natural decline but were, the remnant orders believed, the aftershocks of the Tidecaller's passage. Their representative was a woman named Elder Tham. She was older than she looked, and she spoke without the diplomatic cushioning that Olin and Veska had used. "You found the Ashenvale," she said. "Yes. And you understand what it was built to do." "Saren has explained it." A pause. "Saren is functional?" "Very," I said. The pause stretched out for a long moment. "Mr. Marsh," Elder Tham said, "the Tidecaller is moving toward your home system. You know this." "I know this." Then you know that the Ashen Veil may be the only thing that stands between your species and extinction. I know that too, I said. Then why, she said very carefully, have you not already agreed to hand it over to someone with the resources to use it? It was a fair question. I sat with it for a moment, turning it over in my mind the way I turned engineering problems over, looking for the part that did not fit, because, I said, the Veil built this ship over 300 years and never got to use it because they trusted the timeline and the timeline was wrong. The Conclave will study it until there is nothing left to study and then form a committee. The Sindarchy will monetize it, and the remnant orders, respectfully, have been fighting the effects of the Tidecaller for thousands of years with no outcome that has changed its behavior even once. I paused. I have been on this ship for 3 weeks and I have already fixed things that were declared unfixable. I am not ready to hand it to someone else. Elder Tham was quiet for a long time. What are you planning to do with it? She said. I am still working that out, I said honestly, but I will tell you when I know. The attempt on my life came 8 days after that conversation. I had known it was coming in the way you know a storm is coming when you can read the weather. Not because you can see it yet, but because all the small signs have been pointing in one direction. The Sindarchy had stopped hailing me. That was the sign. People who are planning something stop talking. I was in the lower maintenance corridor, 3 levels below the weapons bay, rewiring a secondary power conduit that had been running at reduced capacity. The conduit work required both hands and most of my attention, and I was deep enough in the ship that Saren's internal sensors had a small coverage gap. She had told me about the gap in the first week. I had flagged it for repair and not yet gotten to it. Someone else had noticed the gap and used it. I heard the footstep, one, just one, a weight shift on the corridor floor behind me, and I did not think. 9 years of working alone in the most isolated parts of deep space had built a set of reflexes that did not wait for thought. I dropped flat, rolled left, and the cutting tool that had been aimed at my head carved a line of pale heat across the wall above me. I came up with the welding torch from my kit in my right hand, lit it, and held it between myself and the figure in the corridor. There was one of them. Tall, wearing a suit without markings, carrying equipment that was Sindarchy manufactured even without the logo. They stopped when they saw the torch. This is a delicate negotiation, I said, and you have handled it poorly. They rushed me. I stepped to the side of the corridor and let the torch do a specific targeted job on the equipment they were carrying, which became inoperative immediately and also very warm. They stopped again. The corridor was narrow. I was between them and the only exit. Saren, I said, I need you in this section. I am rerouting 40% of the ship's defensive energy to your corridor. She said through the suit communicator, and the lights in the corridor shifted to a very deep red. The walls began to hum. The suited figure looked at the walls, looked at me, and made the correct calculation. They retreated. I did not chase them. I followed slowly enough to watch them go, making sure they reached the breach in the hull and left the ship. Then I sealed the breach with a temporary patch I had been meaning to install anyway. Are you injured? Saren asked. No, I said. You were statistically unlikely to survive that encounter with a welding torch. And yet, I said. She made the thoughtful exhale sound again. The Sindarchy will try again. Probably, I said. That is why I am going to finish what I am building before they do. Kaylin. Her voice had shifted to the tone she used when she was about to say something she had been holding back. What are you building? I have the schematics you have been working on. I understand the technical components individually. But the system you are designing, it is not the Veil's weapon. No, I said, it is not. The Veil designed a disruption signal, a way to create confusion in the Tidecaller's processing, to buy time for civilizations in its path. I know what the Veil designed, I said, and it is brilliant, and it was not enough, and they died before they could use it. I looked down at the schematics on my wrist display. I am not building a disruption signal, Saren. I am building something that will go further. How much further? I was quiet for a moment. Far enough that I do not want to say it out loud yet, I said. Give me more time. She gave me more time. The ship lifted off on a morning that Vethura did not have, because Vethura had no mornings, only the slow crawl of its distant star across a permanent purple dark. But my internal clock said morning, and so I called it that. 3 months had passed since the first conclave ship had appeared in orbit. In those 3 months, the situation above Vethura had grown considerably more crowded. 7 ships now maintained permanent positions in orbit. 2 conclave vessels, 2 Sindarchy ships that kept their distance since the incident in the corridor, 1 remnant orders craft, and 2 ships belonging to smaller civilizations who had arrived simply because everyone else had and they did not want to be left out of whatever was happening. None of them could enter the HFY. Saren had resealed the hull breach within hours of the Sindarchy operative's departure, and the ship's hull material was, it turned out, entirely impervious to every cutting or entry method the orbital ships possessed. They had tried a few, cautiously at first and then less cautiously, and the hull had responded to each attempt with a passive resistance that consumed the energy directed at it and returned nothing. I had found this deeply satisfying. In those 3 months I had also found my crew. Voss arrived first. He was a remnant orders linguist, mid-career, intense in the way that people who have devoted their lives to dead languages become intense. He specialized in pre-extinction communication, not the languages of dead civilizations, but the communication patterns that civilizations produced in their final period, the specific ways that a collective consciousness expressed itself when it knew it was ending. He had requested permission to board the Ashenvale through Elder Tham, and Elder Tham had passed the request to me with a note that said simply, "He is the best at what he does, and what he does is exactly what you need." I had brought him aboard because she was right, and because he had included with his request a 14-page analysis of the Tidecaller's communication fragments that Saren had in her archive, which demonstrated that he understood the problem in a way that nobody else in the galaxy currently did. Voss was small, methodical, and almost entirely without small talk. He sat in the research section with Saren's archive open around him and worked for 18 hours at a stretch without apparent discomfort. He and I did not talk much, but when we talked we understood each other, which is worth more. Rhea arrived second, and she arrived without asking. She came aboard through a method I still do not fully understand, something involving a single-person insertion, craft designed by the Sindarchy for covert operations, which she had stolen when she defected from the Sindarchy 3 years earlier. Saren detected her approach, but did not stop it, which told me something about Saren's opinion of her before I had met her. Rhea was 34 years old. She had the quality that people who have been through something that should have ended them sometimes have, a steadiness, a flatness, like a surface that has been sanded so many times it no longer shows the wood grain. She had been a Sindarchy intelligence operative, and 7 years ago she had been dispatched to investigate an anomaly in a system at the outer edge of the Sindarchy's territory. The anomaly had been a peripheral effect of the Tidecaller's passage. She had been partially caught in it. The Tidecaller had, as Saren described it, begun the process of absorbing her consciousness before it registered that she was not part of a civilization-level collective, that her consciousness was singular, not networked, not part of the interconnected web it was designed to harvest, and so it had discarded her, simply released her. She had been found 3 days later drifting in an escape pod with no memory of the 3 days and a set of neural patterns that no medical system in the Sindarchy could fully explain. The Sindarchy had studied her for 2 years, concluded she was a useful intelligence asset due to her partial exposure, giving her a sensitivity to the Tidecaller's frequency band that no instrumentation could replicate, and then tried to lock her in a research facility indefinitely. She had declined this arrangement and left. "Why do you want to be here?" I asked her, the first hour she was aboard. She looked at me steadily. "Because I am the only living being in the galaxy who has been inside whatever it is," she said, "and I would like very much to make sure it never does that to anyone else." I believed her. I also believed something else that she said later. Quietly, when we were eating in the galley and Voss was still working, and Siren was running calculations in the background. "It discarded me," Rhea said. "It absorbed part of what I was and decided it was not worth keeping. I have spent 7 years thinking about that." She paused. "I was not angry at it. I was not afraid of it. I was ashamed of it. The way you would be ashamed of something that looked at you and turned away." I did not say anything for a moment. "That shame," I said, "is exactly what I need." She looked at me. "I am building a message," I said. "Not a weapon, not a disruption signal, a message. Something that will be received by the Tidecaller in a language it understands, on the frequency it operates on, using the communication patterns that Voss has been mapping, and the sensitivity that you carry from having been. I'm sighted. The message is going to contain everything it has taken. Every civilization it has erased, compressed, modulated, transmitted back at it in its own language of consumed consciousness." Rhea was quiet. "What is the purpose of the message?" she asked. "To make it understand what it has been doing," I said. "Not to destroy it, not to scare it away permanently, to make it feel something it has never felt. Because something that has never been made to understand the weight of what it does. That is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. And the only way to change something like that is to reach it where it lives." She looked at me for a long moment. You are trying to give a god a conscience, she said. I am trying to show a god a mirror, I said. Elder Tham came aboard a week later. Not as a representative of the remnant orders. She made that clear immediately. As a private individual, an old woman who had spent 60 years studying the Tidecaller and had more knowledge about it than anyone alive, and who had quietly decided that the most useful thing she could do was be here. She brought with her the complete Remnant Orders archive on the Tidecaller's movements over 4,000 years of observation. A dataset so large that Saracen spent 3 days integrating it. When she was done, she told me that the archive had shifted her calculation of the Tidecaller's arrival in Earth's home system by 8 years earlier than her previous estimate. 52 years, not 60. I did not tell the others immediately. I finished the work I was doing on the broadcast array, checked the connection Rhea and I had spent 4 days calibrating together, and then told them at dinner, calmly, and then we went back to work. The Ashenvale's lifting off was not announced to anyone. I simply told Saren that it was time, and she engaged the drive systems, ancient, extraordinary, impossibly smooth, and the ship rose through Vithara's thin atmosphere and into the void above, without a sound that anyone outside could hear. The orbital ships scrambled immediately. Hails came in from all 7 of them simultaneously. The Conclave wanted to know what I was doing. The Sindarchy threatened legal action. Elder Tham's original Remnant Orders ship, crewed by people she had not told about her decision to board the Ashenvale, hailed me 3 times before they understood and went silent. I did not respond to any of them. I told Saren to set a course for the Null Corridor's boundary, and the Ashenvale moved. It moved the way nothing I had ever been on moved. There was no vibration, no sense of acceleration. The stars on the forward display simply shifted, and the speed readout climbed to numbers that made me check it twice, and then a 3rd time, and then accept that the Vale had built their ship to be exactly as fast as the legends about it had claimed. We crossed the Null Corridor in 6 hours. 6 hours to travel a distance that had taken me 3 days inbound on my previous ship at maximum speed. Voss was at his station the entire time, cataloging the Tidecaller communication fragments with fresh urgency now that we were in motion. Rhea sat beside me in the control center, not talking, watching the star display with the look of a person who has been waiting a long time for something and is not entirely sure they want it to arrive. Saren ran the broadcast array through its final pre-transmission diagnostics. She had run these diagnostics 47 times in the previous 3 weeks. This was the 48th. She's nervous, Rhea said quietly. She has been waiting 38,000 years to do this, I said. I think nervous is appropriate. Rhea almost smiled. Almost. Kaelin, said Saren, I need to tell you something about the message you have built. Tell me. The Vale designed the disruption signal to be impersonal, a frequency, a pattern, something that acted on the Tidecaller the way a bright light acts on eyes accustomed to darkness. Not intelligently, just effectively. She paused. What you have built is different. What you have built requires the Tidecaller to receive it as communication, as something directed at it, from something that understands it well enough to speak to it. Yes, I said. If it receives it as communication, Saren said, then it will know that you understand it. It will know that someone out there has studied it closely enough to speak its language. Another pause. It may consider that a threat. I know, I said, you are willing to accept that risk. I looked at the star display. Somewhere in the direction we were heading, something 38,000 years old and incomprehensibly vast was moving through the dark, harvesting the end of worlds. The Vale built a signal, I said. I am building a conversation. Conversations have risks that signals do not. But conversations can also end things that signals never could. Saren was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a voice that carried something I had not heard from her before. Something that might have been, for an entity 38,000 years old, the closest thing to hope she had left. I believe you are right, she said. I have believed it since the 3rd week, when you fixed the node by understanding what the tolerance was wrong about. I was simply waiting until you said it clearly. I did not know what to say to that. So I said nothing. We flew toward the Tidecaller, and behind us, the galaxy watched, and the Ashenvale moved through the dark like something ancient and finally awake. And none of us were afraid, or at least none of us said so out loud. I knew we were close when Rhea put her hand flat on the console and went very still. I had not given her any sensor readout to watch. I had not asked her to monitor anything. She was simply sitting, the way she often sat, quiet, contained, present, and then her hand moved to the console surface and stayed there, and her breathing changed in a way that was not dramatic but was absolutely unmistakable. It is ahead, she said, bearing left of the primary display, maybe 8 light hours. I checked Saren's long-range sensors. They showed nothing yet. The tide collar did not register on conventional instrumentation at this range. How certain are you? I asked. Certain, she said. I had learned, over the weeks aboard the Ashenvale, that Rhea did not use words carelessly. Certain meant certain. Saren, adjust our bearing, I said. Adjusting? Saren said, and then 4 minutes later, I have it on specialized array. She is correct. Bearing confirmed. Saren had spent the journey recalibrating her detection systems using the data Rhea's neural sensitivity provided as a guide. A strange, unprecedented collaboration between ancient instrumentation and a human nervous system that had been partially rewritten by the very thing we were chasing. The result was a detection range 3 times what the Ashenvale's original sensors could achieve alone. We reduced speed, not because we needed to approach carefully. The tide collar was not a physical object that could be startled by an approach vector, but because Voss needed more time. He had been awake for 31 hours, working through the final calibrations of the message structure with the focused urgency of someone who understood exactly what a mistake would mean. If the message is modulated incorrectly, he had told me, the night before, it will not be received as communication. It will be received as noise, and noise is not interesting to something this old. It will simply pass through it and we will have used our one opportunity. How close are you to certain? I asked. He had looked at his work. 91%, he said. What would make it 95? Another 4 hours. You have 6, I said. Use them. He had looked at me with the expression of a person who had spent their career working for institutions that gave them half the time they needed, and twice the bureaucracy, encountering for the first time someone who simply gave them the time. He used all 6 hours. The message was, at its structural core, a compression of everything Saren had recorded about the tide collar's harvests over 38,000 years. Every civilization erased, every world silenced, not described that was too thin, too distant. Instead, it used the communication patterns that the tide collar itself had left behind in the wakes of its harvests. The residual frequencies that remnant orders had been documenting for 4,000 years, the faint echoes of consciousness bursts absorbed and replicated them, sent them back. Every end that had been consumed reflected in the language of its consumption. But I had added a layer that was not in the original concept, one final modulation that I had designed alone, in the late watches when the others were sleeping, that I had not fully explained to anyone yet. The tide collar had discarded Rhea because she was a single consciousness, not a collective. What it had taken from her, a fragment of her specific identity and history and memory, it had judged insufficient, not worth keeping. She had spent 7 years carrying that. I had taken that specific fragment of feeling, the unique neural signature that Rhea's partial exposure had left in her, which she had allowed me and Saren to map over weeks of patient, careful work that she had endured without flinching, and I had woven it into the message as a carrier signal, not to hurt the tide collar, not to transmit her pain at it, to make it recognize what it had discarded, make it understand that the thing it had thrown away was the thing that mattered most, that a single consciousness, irreplaceable, unrepeatable, is not insufficient, it is the entire point. I had told Rhea about this on the morning before we reached the tide collar's position. She had listened without speaking for a long time. You used me as a weapon, she said finally. I used what was done to you as the most precise tool I had, I said. There is a difference. She thought about that. Yes, she said. There is a difference. She looked at the display. Will it work? I do not know, I said honestly. But I know that the Veil's signal would have bought time. What I have built might do something the Veil never had the data to attempt. It might change what the tide collar decides to do, not just interrupt it. That is either very brave or very foolish, she said. Those are not always different things, I said. She almost smiled again. This time she made it all the way. The tide collar became visible, and visible is not the right word, because you do not see it with eyes. When we were 2 light hours out, what Saren's specialized array showed was a distortion, a region of space where the normal behavior of energy and matter was subtly wrongly off, like a place in a room where the air is a different temperature, and you cannot see why. The distortion was enormous, spanning an area of space that would have taken hours to cross at conventional speeds, and it moved with a slow, absolute, unhurried certainty that was more disturbing than any speed would have been. Elder Tham stood at the display beside me for a long time without speaking. I have spent 60 years studying it, she said, and I have never been this close. How does it feel? I asked. Like standing at the edge of something very old and being reminded of how young everything you know is, she said. Voss came to the control center when we reached 1 light hour out. He stood behind his station. his calibrations complete, and he looked at the distortion on the display and then looked at me. "Ready," he said. I looked at Saren. "Ready?" "The broadcast array is at full capacity," she said. "Message is loaded and staged for transmission on your command." A pause. "Kalen, I want to say something before you give the command." "Say it." "The Vale spent 300 years building this ship," she said. "They never got to use it. I have spent 38,000 years waiting to be used. And in all of that time, across everything I observed and recorded and processed, I never believed that the Tidecaller could be reached by communication. I believed it was beyond the range of anything that could be called dialogue." She paused again. "I was wrong. I know that now, because you showed me that the design tolerance was wrong. You showed me that the thing designed to be the limit of what is possible is sometimes simply the limit of what was imagined." Another pause. "Thank you for walking through my door." I did not say anything for a moment. "Thank you for leaving it open," I said. I looked at the distortion. I thought about the Vale and their 300 years, and their 38,000 years of silence. I thought about Rhea, and the 7 years she had spent being ashamed of surviving. I thought about Voss and every dead language he had ever learned to speak. I thought about Elder Tham and 60 years of patient watching. I thought about Earth, 52 years away from something that did not know yet that the calculation had changed. "Transmit," I said. The Ashen Veil fired, not with light, not with force, with sound in the loosest possible sense of the word, a broadcast on a frequency that did not have a name in any human language, a transmission that carried within it the compressed weight of everything the Tidecaller had ever consumed, structured into the language the consumption itself had left behind. Carrier waved on the neural signature of a woman who had been found insufficient and had refused to accept the verdict. The transmission lasted 11 seconds, then we waited. The distortion ahead of us continued to move. It did not stop immediately. It continued its slow absolute trajectory for another 47 seconds, and those 47 seconds were the longest I had ever lived through, longer than the crash on Vethera, longer than the corridor with the cutting tool, longer than any of it. I watched the display and said nothing and breathed, and then the distortion stopped, not slowed, stopped. Saren's voice was quiet and precise. "The Tidecaller has ceased forward movement. I am measuring a deviation of 0.4 seconds in its approach vector, recalibrating. 0.4 seconds. I had known, intellectually, that for something processing at the quantum level, that was an eternity. But I had not expected to feel how enormous it was until I watched that distortion hold still in space, and understood that something which had been moving uninterrupted for 38,000 years had paused. It had felt something. Then it responded. Saren registered the return signal before any of us could perceive it. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a something I had never heard from her in all the weeks we had been together. Something that was not quite wonder, because wonder requires surprise, and I think she had been hoping for this, but something in that direction. "It is transmitting," she said. "Single concept signal. Repeating, I am translating," she translated. "Again," she said. "It is saying again." I looked at Rhea. Rhea looked at the display. "Again," Voss repeated quietly from his station, as though he was tasting the word. "Transmit again," I said. Saren transmitted. Identical signal, identical structure, identical weight. The distortion retreated. Not fled, retreated, the deliberate, measured movement of something that is not running but is recalibrating, moving back to a distance from which it could process what it had received without it crowding the processing space. It transmitted again. A different signal this time. Saren took longer to translate it. "It is more complex," she said. "Multiple concepts. I am working through the structure." We waited 3 minutes, then Saren said, "The closest translation I can achieve is, 'What are you?' Not as a question about species or biology, as a question about category. It is asking what category of thing is capable of doing what you just did." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "Transmit this, a single concept. Translate it as precisely as you can into its language. The concept is, a thing that does not end." Saren translated it, transmitted it. The distortion held still for a long time, a very long time. 17 minutes by the display, in which none of us spoke or moved very much, and the Ashen Veil sat in the dark between the stars waiting. Then the Tidecaller moved. Backward. Away from us, away from the course that had been pointing toward Earth's home system. Away and back and further back. Saren tracked it in silence until the long-range sensors reached their limit and the distortion vanished from the display entirely. "It has retreated 12,000 light-years," she said. "Based on the trajectory, it has moved out of this galactic cluster entirely. It is beyond my sensor range. I cannot predict its next movement." Nobody said anything for a moment. Elder Tham sat down in the navigator's seat and looked at the empty display where the distortion had been. Voss put his hand against the wall of the control center and held it there, not dramatically, just as a person holds a wall when they need something solid to touch. Rhea looked at me for a long time. Her face was not triumphant. It was quiet, the way something is quiet when a weight it has carried for a very long time has been set down somewhere it did not expect to set it down, and the muscles do not yet know how to carry nothing. It left, she said. It left, I said. You made it feel something. We made it feel something, I said. All of us. Everything that went into that message was all of us. She nodded, slowly. Then she looked back at the display. What came next was the part I had been least looking forward to. The galactic community had watched everything on long-range instruments, and the moment the tide caller's retreat became measurable by external sensors, which took approximately 4 hours after it happened, the hailing frequencies lit up in a way that made our previous communications feel quiet. Every major civilization wanted to speak to me. The Conclave wanted to convene an emergency session with me as the central subject. The Sindarchy, in an impressive pivot, changed their position entirely and issued a statement claiming that they had been supportive of my efforts all along. The remnant orders sent a message through Elder Tham that consisted of a single line. We would like to revise several thousand years of doctrine. I answered none of them that day. I told Saren to log every message and sort them by urgency, and then I went to the galley and ate the first proper meal I had cooked in weeks and sat at the table and was quiet for a while. Rhea came and sat across from me. We ate in silence for some time. What will you do now? She asked. File the salvage claim properly, I said. No joint custody. No asterisks. She raised an eyebrow. That will take some time. 6 weeks, I said. I know. I have done harder things recently. She almost laughed. Almost. And after that, she said. I looked at the table. Then I looked at the display on the galley wall, which showed the star map in its current configuration. The Ashenvale's position marked as a small point of light, surrounded by an enormous amount of universe. The tide caller left, I said. It did not die. It did not change permanently. It retreated because it encountered something it did not have a category for, and it needs time to process that. It will return eventually, maybe in 100 years, maybe in 1,000, and when it does, the message will need to be more complex. The conversation will need to go further. I paused. So I will keep working, I said. What else would I do? The Ashenvale moved through the dark, heading back toward the inhabited galaxy at a speed that made the stars shift, and somewhere behind us, something enormous and ancient was processing a feeling it had never had before. That is the thing about humans no one in this galaxy seemed to understand until now. We do not survive because we are the strongest, or the fastest, or the best prepared. We do not survive because we are lucky. We survive because when something tries to make us feel small, we get curious about it instead. We take it apart. We study it. We learn its language. We reach into the dark where it lives and we say, I see you. I know what you have done. And you are going to have to deal with me. Curiosity, in the right hands, is the most dangerous weapon in existence. I have the right hands, and I intend to keep using them.